So I'm Mark Sousa. I'm your GATRA's administrator. I think the last time we met, if we have, it was when I was actually at the December meeting, when I was voted in as the administrator. And since then, things have gotten a little bit, little crazy. So we wanted to have this meeting today for the Finance Committee, and then the board meeting tomorrow, so we can pretty much approve the FY20 budget, the second revision, and then going forward, the foundation of an FY21 budget. And we can kind of explain our rationale on how we put these together. In the room with me right now is Nancy Foley, she's administrative assistant, and I have Dan Burgess, who's our CFO. And he and I worked on this budget. He worked with Frank previously with the 20 budget. Basically, he and I worked together to finalize the revision of 20 budget and to put in place the 21 budget to going forward. What I can do is briefly give you a kind of a how we came to where we are today with the 20 budget first. As you know, in March, COVID-19 hit. Basically, we changed the way that we did business like everybody else. We sent all our staff home to work from home. We shut down the building. We shut down the terminal. We continued to provide service. However, the one major issue that this did to all the RTAs, not just GATRA, but and the MBTA, is that revenue stopped coming in into our offices and pretty much the end of March. That was the end of any revenue coming in. Thankfully, the CARES Act was passed, which allowed us to secure federal funds to finalize the 20 budget and moving forward. We have actually, in the guidance of the FTA and the state, Mass DOT, we have actually balanced our FY20 budget utilizing the CARES Act funds, which can be used to, which we've been in the advice of the two, the federal government and the state, was to do that. All the RTAs did the same thing. MBTA was doing the same thing. With that being said, we basically took the revenue that we lost and kind of plugged it into the budget to balance it. And so what we're presenting to the committee right now is a balanced 20 budget. We can discuss 20 budget first, and I can turn it over to Dan. We can put the budget up on the screen if you'd like, just so we can go through the lines that we had presented to the committee, and we can go from there. Unless anybody has any other questions right now on actually what I've presented so far. If not, we will bring up the FY20 budget to the screen. We share it, right? How do you remember how to do that? You have to share on the right-hand side, Nancy. All the way over. And we can bring up the, yeah. There we go. You want to fill the screen?
You want to take that? You want a full screen?
Yeah. Can everybody see that?
Yes.
Okay. What I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this over to Dan, so he can kind of explain how we got to where we are. You want to take that? Want to drive down? And so basically, as I said, this is just kind of put everything on paper, kind of pulling it all together, and just so you can see exactly where we are with the administrative budget and the operating budget to balance the FY20 budget. So I'll turn it over to Dan Burgess.
So I'll give you a quick, general run through some of the highlights here. And then obviously, if you have any questions, what I'll do is I'll hit the administrative portion. And then if you've got any questions specific to this section, feel free to speak up, and then we'll go on to the operating side after that. So you'll see, for the most part, both the areas outside of personnel, the services and the office expense and the interest expense, the administrative section were pretty much unchanged from the initial budget. The personnel line, there was a fairly substantial increase. It was about, I got my notes on my other computer here. So it was about a 17% increase. This is related to this fringe benefits line down here, with the exception of some salary increases that were voted, I believe, at the December meeting, but were not included in the budget that was voted in the December meeting. So they needed to be added here. So that fringe benefit number increase is made up of a couple of things. It's a roughly $30,000 adjustment to the allocation of fringe benefit costs between the admin and the brokerage. And then the remaining amount is the final payout for the former administrator's balance of vacation and sick time. So that's really the difference there. Moving to the brokerage portion, you'll see the personnel side's pretty straightforward. There's a few salary increases. Again, these are items that were voted in December. And the services and the office expense are pretty much the same, if not exactly the same as they were. So not a tremendous amount of change here, with the exception, I said, of that one fringe benefit line. Does anybody have any specific questions to this section?
I guess one thing I should have said, I apologize, I didn't at the beginning, just so everybody knows, this meeting is being recorded. So I just would like to give everybody a kind of a heads up on that. So.
Could you just tell me again why the fringe benefits went up 100?
Yeah, so as I said, in this number includes the majority of that increase is related to the final payouts for the former administrator's accrued sick and vacation time per his contract.
That was one person?
Yes.
Yes, that was Frank Gay, the previous administrator's retirement buyout.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Could we possibly get a breakdown on that at some point?
Yeah, I think we can get a breakdown for that. Yep.
Okay, and then I have one other question, if I could. I also see in here an administrative secretary too. Is that an additional position? Is that a new position?
Yeah, so that's a new receptionist that was added in. Yep.
Thank you.
Yep. All right, if there are any other questions, we'll move over to the operating side. The numbers here are there's quite a bit of variability between community to community. The main driving force here is just adjusting to how each service was affected essentially by the COVID-19 pandemic. And many of these have all now been adjusted back to a much more reasonable projection of the end of the fiscal year based on activity through the end of May. So we're kind of seeing, in some cases, there's only a slight drop, in some cases a significant drop, and in some cases it's pretty much the same. It really just depends on what's going on within each one of those services and what kind of activity we're seeing still. And then similar situations happening with demand response. Some of the communities are down, some of them are up. That has a lot to do with some correction that was happening between allocation of services. So we're more accurately reflecting fiscal year end numbers, actuals as opposed to the budgeted numbers. So there is some changes here, but for the most part, there's just a decrease. And so fixed route is down about 8% in total based on compared to the revision 1, and the demand response is down just a couple percent. And so that's demand response. Commuter rail. This is the operations for both the Attleboro and Mansfield train stations. Of course, in Attleboro, we also operate the parking lot. Those costs aren't down significantly from what they're projected to be. The Mansfield station, simply because there isn't a ton of activity there at all. If you look at the dollar amounts, it's fairly minimal. And the Attleboro station, much like we'll see when we talk about 21 budget, unfortunately, a lot of the costs to operate that station are really a cost that we have to incur regardless of how much capacity we're seeing as far as parking revenue. So, maintenance, security, things like that, we still have to, that work still has to be done. We still have to make sure we take care of the lot, even if there aren't a lot of, we're not getting a lot of people in every day. Obviously, a lot of people aren't riding the train at this point. So, there's only a slight reduction in the expected cost to operate or keep that facility running. And then the human services transportation piece, that's the brokerage, medical brokerage. There's a significant, we saw a significant drop again with COVID-19 and towards the end of our 20 budget period. So this is just a conservative estimate as to where we think we're going to end up. We are starting to see some activity picking back up in this area, which is encouraging for 21. And when we get to 21, again, you'll see the budget numbers kind of recovering there from what we think we're going to see based on the trends we're seeing in May and June. So then you see the overall budget change, which is a significant drop, which is to be expected. And then just a quick run through the revenue. But fare box revenue for both fixed route and dial-a-ride is down substantially. Again, not surprising based on what's going on and the fact that we've been fare free for several months now. Human services, which is the brokerage again. So the revenue and expense pretty much run in line with this operation, this piece of the operation, or essentially functioning as a pass-through for Human Services Transportation Department at the state. Federal numbers, federal operating money. Last year, we were just about almost $5.5 million of operating money from the feds. This is down slightly because of the CARES piece. And we'll see in 21 that we're at this point projecting all of our federal funding, operating funding next year will be from the CARES Act money. There'll be no formula grant operating money next year for us that we'll be budgeting. Taunton Terminal, again, when the building was closed as part of that COVID-19, we froze the rents on our tenants. So that's the reason we're seeing this drop in the rent revenue. Commuter rail is actually, this is interesting that there's actually was an increase over what we had projected for a number here. And I think had we not had this pandemic, we would have seen a significantly larger amount of commuter rail revenue. The parking lot was doing quite well. So in spite of the loss in the ridership for the T out of our station, the revenue was still pretty healthy for the parking lot compared to budget anyway. The United Way is just part of the MedWheels grant. It's just, we just saw less in that window, in that line than we expected. And then this is our microtransit program that is actually ramping up. We have more pilots in 21. So it's pretty much on budget, just $20,000 difference. And then of course, the way the formula works is the net remaining cost to be funded is split between the state contract assistance and our local communities, local assessments. And this number is the projected local assessment number for FY20. As you may or may not know, that number is actually not calculated till the end of the fiscal year because we're 2 years in arrears on the local assessments. So we actually wait 2 years to get the funding that's related to this amount. So as part of our financial statements that you'll see in a couple of months. We'll have a schedule for the local assessments for FY20. But this is just a 2.5% increase from the prior year, which is our standard, unless there's a new service added. So I think that's everything there. And if you've got any questions, I'm free to try and answer them for you.
So I would say especially in the dial-a-ride program, social distancing on vehicles was a big deal. And with our HST transportation at the end of this fiscal year, we were doing maybe one person on a vehicle at a time, maybe two, but that was the most. As far as the fixed route goes, we saw a decrease of our ridership, not as much as other transit authorities in the state, because I do believe that GATRA is an essential service for a lot of folks that stayed in the construction business, in the grocery stores, things like that, and they needed the buses to get to work, basically. So we didn't cut back our service as much as others had. The only really cutback we did was we kept the morning service for folks that could get to work, and we just cut back on our night service. And we utilized our vehicles in a different way, where if we had to pick up people at a train station and get them back to a commuter lot somewhere, we would utilize our smaller vehicles, vans, and utilize more like on a one-to-one basis. So that was kind of why some of the operating budget, you saw some decreases, but then the CARES Act did kind of step in to kind of plug the gap, so to speak. So, and I'll explain kind of what 21 and what we're going to be doing. If there's any more questions on 20, we can move to 21.
Excuse me, Mike Gallagher from the town of North Attleboro. I have a question on the 20. On the CARES Act, I know that's reimbursable for expenses. What are the biggest drivers for you for the CARES Act? That's a big number. Is it primarily?
Yeah, so the single biggest item is the loss of fare box revenue, really. As I said, we've been fare free since March. So.
And you're actually able to claim that under the CARES Act?
That's correct.
Okay. All right, because we were pretty restricted on the things that we could do as a municipality under the CARES Act to try to get some assistance from the state. Are you applying through the Commonwealth for all of that, or are you?
No, it's direct federal funding.
We were
direct
direct recipient, and we also have local agreements with our UZA agreements with the Boston urbanized zone, and also the Rhode Island urbanized zone. So those actually were extra funds that were actually, because of the way that the CARES Act was funded and the formula that we used, it's basically left for kind of added, continue to add some funds to our grants. So, and the grants have been secured through the FTA, and we can currently draw down from them. So we follow the guidance of the FTA after several phone calls. There's a lot of confusion. There was a lot of different questions and answers out there. We had some issues, some of our contractors that unfortunately had to lay off their folks. Could they get reimbursed? We had to get some guidance from FTA on that, because I think we have, I don't even know how many, 45 contractors or something like that. I know I signed them all the other day.
The brokerage side. Yeah.
The brokerage side. So it's been a kind of a moving target, Mike, kind of to get through, this budget year. So, and I think you'll see in 21 what we've done, I think is pretty responsible. So.
Okay, thank you very much. Appreciate that.
Yeah.
So we'll pull up 21.
Do you want Nancy, you want to do this?
And while Nancy's doing that, I'll kind of explain our rationale for the FY21 budget. The one thing that we decided to do was be pretty conservative on our foundation budget for the 21 budget. Because the unknown is out there right now. We don't know what the fall is going to bring us. We don't know when the ridership is going to come back to full revenue. We are still not taking fares as of yet. We did a lot of rear boardings and tried to. We don't have a lot of vehicles that can do that, but to secure our operators and things. Back in March when this all happened, we were kind of scrambling to make sure we were trying to keep our employees safe. So what Dan and I discussed and Dan put together was what you're going to see here is a pretty conservative budget. We believe we're going to have to come back to the board and probably get an amendment or an updated budget, because as time will go on, I think the fall will tell us quite a bit of when the governor has his phasing in. I know that he did his step 2 of phase 2 today with the restaurants, and I think you'll see, so I do think you'll see some ridership picking up. Again, we're still not collecting fares. We're kind of following the lead of the majority of the other RTAs, so we're all kind of on the same page. There has been some, I think, like in the Cape, and I think the Cape and the islands, they may have been collecting fares somewhat, but at this point, we're still not ready to do it. I have opened up a dialogue with our union for reopening phase from GATRA's perspective, which is reopening of the vehicles as far as the fares go, reopening of the terminal, reopening of our office, things like that, things that we've been able to utilize, and how we are sanitizing the vehicles and all of those type of processes. So we're actually putting together a reopening plan for GATRA as the phases from the governor's office continue. At this point, staff will continue to stay work from home, and we have not increased our routes as of yet. Once we get kind of some better projections on numbers as far as riders go and where they're going, and if we start seeing an uptick on more trips to restaurants or to some of the other local establishments, then we'll adjust accordingly. So again, what I think you're going to see here is a pretty conservative budget. And again, I do believe we'll have to come back to the board with a update or an amendment or revision. We just don't know what that timeline is until we get a better sense of as the fall comes around. So as it stands right now, I'll turn this back over to Dan for the 21, what we call is a foundation budget. Also, I do want to add that Dan and I are working on, and staff, our directors are working on the budget and how we actually set the formulas up, how we break it down, things like that. So we're working on the actual budget. So what you might see, maybe not today, but what you might see in the future is a little bit of a different budget than you've seen in the past, only because I'll have a little bit more of a breakdown. And so what I think you'll see today is pretty similar to what you've seen. But I will say in the future, you may see just a different format and a little bit more, so some more breakdown. Because the transparency is so important. So Dan, I'll turn it over to you.
Sure. All right. So obviously, as you can see, there is some minor changes to the presentation between 20 and 21. As you'll see here, so we're starting with the general administration and the office administration section. This would have been formerly the general admin portion. Personnel and personnel-related costs have been rolled up into a single number here as compared to the prior year layout. Otherwise, the presentation is pretty similar. We've added another line here for both HST brokerage and the office admin, which is this other expense, which helps to just break out specific things like utilities, insurance, and then some miscellaneous expense that's in there as well. It really wasn't broken out on its own before. So you can see here the personnel for office admin is actually down slightly. That says, or related to the fact that there isn't that payout in the current year that there was in the prior year for the former administrator. And other than that, the total cost for these two areas have actually only increased a few percent. It's about 4% for each section, for each portion here for the general admin piece. And jumping down into the, so I'll go through the expenses and we can field some questions and I'll move over to the revenue. And the operations, much like last year, in the 20 budget, as I said, there's a lot of variability here. I will point out a couple of quick things. The town of Medway is in here, is broken out. You'll see last year, the 20, there was no fixed route line for Medway. This was an oversight, and this number in the past was included in the demand response number. So the demand response and the shuttle number were combined. But as part of the 21 budget, I did break out the Medway shuttle as under the fixed route piece. And then again, some, a variety of changes or increases or decreases projected within some of these communities. It just depends on how much service we're running now and how much we anticipate to run and how early we plan on ramping up service in those areas. For instance, you'll see in a lot of the communities just have a small shuttle, especially the MBTA shuttles. The projections have come down even from this year's numbers, like someone like Pembroke, that number's down about almost 30%, just because we are running the train isn't really running with any great regularity. And so I don't know how long it'll be before we start to see that service get picked up. And so
That is part of this phase though right now. So the MBTA did announce that they were doing, I think 60 more trains.
Okay. So that's things up there, and we'll see. And the other thing is, and a comment I have for later, but we can mention it now, is that we don't really know at this point how employers are going to handle this new normal. I think a lot of employers that may have been hesitant to use a lot of remote work have now been forced to, and may find that it was actually advantageous from a fiscal standpoint to use remote employees. So I would not be surprised to see an overall reduction in ridership for the commuter rail once things have returned to whatever normal it's going to be. And if that is the case, then we will see a natural drop in these various shuttle services. So the fixed route right now we're projecting to be about between 8 and 9% of a reduction from where we're ending this year on the budget. Again, it's a conservative approach. If we're fortunate enough to have service come back faster as we move into our first revision for this budget later in the fall, then we'll have to adjust these numbers accordingly. And demand response is very similar. Some variability between the communities depending on what service is running and how quickly we expect it to pick back up. And so we're looking at about, I think it's about the same, the percentage change is about the same. It's about 7.5% demand response, a reduction in total compared to the current year. So this is a fairly conservative approach, and we're anticipating it's going to take some time before things start to come back to anywhere near the level they were pre-COVID. And as I had mentioned in the previous budget, our human services transportation brokerage operation, we're currently expecting to see the trends continue that we're seeing here in June with the number of trips and services that are needed. Many of these services are critical health services, such as dialysis. So it's reasonably expected that once things start to get a little bit, the situation improves slightly health-wise, we're going to see a significant increase in the demand for these trips.
Yeah. So if I can jump in here, it's just so you know, when this all happened, our HST group has about 18 staff that basically call takers, schedulers, supervisors. What I did is when this started to happen, I split them in two teams. So only half would be here in the office at any one time, so they're not kind of on top of each other. As of 2 weeks ago, the uptick in calls that started to come through we basically had to, at some point, knew we'd have to bring them all back. Before we did that, we basically protected each and all cubicles with vinyl. They all have their own, they're all in their own space. So as of 2 weeks ago, today, we brought back a full staff of call takers, and the calls have been increasing, starting to increase. As each week goes by, we're getting, the call volumes are going up considerably. So that's why, as Dan mentioned, that the number here we think is going to, when things open up, we're already starting to see doctor's appointments and things that are coming in. So we do think those will be essential. And so that's it kind of explains how we get to that number. Good, Dan, sorry.
All right. And then, so to move down here to the commuter rail, as we mentioned in the previous budget, the Attleboro station, there's a critical service level there as far as maintaining, the maintenance of the parking lot, security, things of that nature. So there's an insurance. There's only so much we can do to reduce the expenses related to the maintenance of and the maintaining of that oversight of that parking lot, even with reduction in the amount of people riding the train. And so that brings us down to a total operating budget that's a slight increase from where we're leaving 20. So we'll see exactly where things fall. Obviously, it's very early, as we've said before. There's still a lot of variability out there, and we don't really. We're just going to try and be as conservative as we can, and come up with a budget that makes some sense, and then revisit it as it's needed. So, do you have any questions on the expense side of this budget? Go ahead.
Yes,
Mike. There you go.
Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, thank you. Mike Gallagher from the town of North Attleboro. Thanks very much for going through all of that. I may have missed something on the general administrative expenses. Could you explain the drivers behind the $74,000 increase for services and that $113,000 other expense there?
Yeah, so the 113 is, as I had mentioned before, it was utilities. These items had been broken out. They were otherwise buried in the budget with the format that was used. And I think Mark and I both felt as though those costs should be more clearly pulled out and put on the face of the budget. So that is essentially makes up, there's a lot of items in there, but the big items are the utilities and insurance that are in there. So that would be our general liability insurance and electricity, telephone, water, sewer, and the services. Don't have a specific breakdown on that. I can certainly get that to you though, if you'd like.
Yeah, I would. If you would, I'd like to understand
sure.
what that, because that's a pretty good sized number.
Yeah.
And then the office expenses, the 16,000 increase in the office expenses, is that due to some of the COVID expenses that you're incurring?
Yeah, so that's just, exactly. And there's a couple of items in there as well. I do, like I said, I have some backup for these, but I don't have it in front of me at the moment, but I can give you a rundown on what makes up that number as well.
Thank you, I appreciate that. And then jumping down to your fixed routes, I noticed that the majority of the communities have decreases from the revision 2 of the budget that you presented just a little bit ago for fiscal year 20. But there's like a half a dozen communities, including North Attleboro, that have increases from that. And I know you talked about, bus routes starting up, et cetera, et cetera. It just seems interesting that those 6 communities are going back to almost normal level, if you will, pre-COVID.
Right.
From
So
an expense perspective.
Yeah. So as I said, obviously there's a component there that's, depending on what services are being utilized when. The other piece here is there's a matching of these costs more accurately to the actuals that we're seeing in the general ledger by community. And so you'll see there are some communities there where probably the allocation wasn't, the allocation base that had been used historically was in some need of updating. And so as part of this process, this budgeting process, especially with 21, there's a tremendous amount of work done to actually do some analysis based on ridership and vehicle revenue miles for services that are split between multiple communities to more accurately allocate the services costs between communities. And that is something that was, there was we're using an older allocation basis, and was certainly time to do some updating as to how that was done. And so going forward, the way this will work is every time any budget's prepared, a revision or a foundation budget, we'll be looking at the allocation and making the appropriate adjustments as needed based on ridership and revenue miles to get the most accurate cost per community for services that are split.
So based on that, could we potentially be seeing, and I need to focus a little bit here on North Attleboro.
No.
Could we potentially be seeing an increase in our costs for fiscal year 21 over what our former costs have been? And we're in the same boat you guys are in. We're trying to do our budget for fiscal 21, which we've just passed, but we're also concerned about fiscal 2022, which is when we're going to see the biggest hit from all of this COVID nonsense that we've had to deal with. But that's a concern to me going forward, that if we have to make that adjustment into fiscal year 2022, it could impact some other areas that we're thinking about for that year. So if we could just get an idea of that, that would be helpful also.
And I think, Mike, what we'll do too is we'll continue to monitor this budget and even if it's an uptick or what we're seeing a trend that will affect the communities, we're going to do what we can to make sure that you're aware of where we are. We're going to continue to monitor this. Dan's position as previous was he never really was in charge of the budget and monitoring the budget and following it along. His new working under my administration, he is now going to be 100% focused on strictly their budget, revenues, grants, where the money is and where it's going, and we'll continue to monitor these things on a monthly basis. So you may be hearing from us, a couple months in just to say, hey, this is where we are, or this is what we're looking at. This is the trend, and as things move along, get differently, we'll try to communicate that with all the communities so they're well aware of being on track and where they're going to be. And we also agree that FY22 is an unknown,
Yes.
and we're well aware of where that is. So we agree with you.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. I just need to know if we're going to be trending upward going forward into 22, 23, 24 as we're starting to do our thinking for that. We just need to understand what our expenses could.
Absolutely. Totally understand.
Thank you.
If there aren't any other questions, I'll move on to the revenue side. So again, the format's slightly different here. I think it helps to kind of simplify things a bit. In the past, the 20 budget and previous, the revenue really wasn't cleanly separated from the expense, and some expense got filtered into revenue for whatever reason. So I think this helps to kind of clearly define the total operating expense and then the total revenue. Again, as we were showing the with the fixed route and demand response expenses projected to be reduced over the 20, you'll see here that also right along with it, farebox revenue we're projecting a significant decrease. So the demand response and the fixed route together, we're averaging about 7 to 8% reduction in total expense. But we're seeing here is if you look at the numbers in this, it's actually almost 15% expected at this point budgeted reduction in farebox revenue. Again, this is where some of the CARES funding comes into play to help us out, and hopefully we'll be able to ramp up service and we'll begin to take in some farebox revenue again, and we'll have a bit of a rosier picture to present to you in another few months. But as things stand now, I think this is pretty reasonable. The brokerage, again, the revenue, the expense drives the revenue for the most part with the brokerage. So it's a fairly consistent percentage increase over the prior year based on what we're seeing in June for increased trips, and hopefully that will continue. The commuter rail revenue, again, this is kind of a wild card for us, but I think the numbers we're looking at here are fairly conservative. It's about a 25% reduction over what we budgeted for 20. And hopefully as the commuter rail begins to start back up and in a significant way, we'll start to see people returning to the parking lot at some level to help push this number. But I think that's a pretty reasonable number at this time. And then there's some of these quick items down here. I think we're now opening the building back up, and I think as tenants start to return this summer, we'll hopefully see the return of our rents. However, it's still unknown at this time if everyone will be back, and if we'll be able to collect the full rent from everyone, or if we may lose some tenants depending on, these are small businesses, so they may or may not be able to return. That's a small amount of advertising and some interest income here. And then, so the one I wanted to point out on this section is the microtransit pilot. We actually have a couple of additional contracts going into 21 to expand these pilot programs to some other communities. So we're actually going to see some more funding in 21 than we saw in 20 related to these pilot programs. Aside from that, the other big takeaway here is the federal operating assistance line. As you can see, as we discussed earlier, was mainly driven with formula grant money last year, or in 20, and with a small amount of CARES money to supplement. And then this year we are projecting to fund 100% of our operating costs, federal operating costs, through the CARES funds.
That's the 5307 funds.
Yeah, 5307 CARES money. And then again, the state and local assistance, state contract assistance and the local assessments. These are driven strictly by the budgeted numbers for 20, and this is just a 2.5% increase here. And that brings us down to our net budget. So there's a lot to kind of process here, but I think it's all pretty consistent from 20 to 21, that there's just across the board reduction, with the exception of a few items. So if you've got any questions on the revenue, I'm happy to speak on them for you.
I do want to say, I think Dan and his staff have done a great job trying to get this basically as transparent as possible and as accurate as possible with a conservative line. So I just want to say that he has done a great job in trying to present this as is today, and that we'll present to the board. But again, I'll say it, I know we're going to be back at some point with all updated numbers, but at least we have a really good foundation, a conservative foundation moving forward for 21.
All right, if there are any questions, I'll turn it back over to Mark.
Yeah, what we'll do is we'll get some questions answered that was from today. And we will make sure that we have those ready for tomorrow, if we can. And if not, we'll definitely get them to you over the next couple of days. Some of them I think get your hands on pretty easily. So I think we'll be able to answer a lot of those, any of the questions that came up. But if there's no other business that we need to discuss, I just want to say I appreciate your time and letting us present this, and we will we'll have a little bit more on the agenda for tomorrow, but budgets are the two items I wanted to make sure that the finance committee got a chance to look at before the board meeting tomorrow. But we'll have some other things on the agenda for tomorrow to discuss. But I think that's all we need to do, right, Nance? You think?
I think so.
Okay.
I'm not sure if we can do a motion or.
Well, there's three members, so there's three members, or two members in designated. So I think we can have a motion to adjourn.
Mark, if I could, Mike Gallagher from North Attleboro. Before
Sure.
I make that motion, I want to welcome you on board. I didn't get a chance to meet you in December. I apologize for that. Things got a little crazy around here, but hoping to, looking forward to actually meeting with you soon.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. It has been a little bit of a, like kind of coming in the door and then here's the
Heck of a
fire.
ride.
So it's pretty
Yeah,
much what happened.
Yeah, you and Mike Borg have a lot in common here. And when Mike came into North Attleboro, he started March 2nd, so he's been dealing with the same
Oh.
thing. Here, so.
At least I had a month under my belt. That's about
Yeah,
it.
there you go. There you go. So, but again, welcome. And I would make a motion to adjourn.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, all in favor?
Doesn't that has to be should that be a roll call?
Yes.
Sure. Okay, I can do the roll call if that's okay for everybody.
That'd be great.
Mike,
Yes.
Ed,
Yes.
Joe?
Yes.
Okay, we are adjourned and I appreciate your time and